All right, so this is the Dev Book Club. We are covering Chapter 10 of the Implementing Domain-Driven Design book by Vaughn Vernon. I'll be talking about aggregates tonight. I'm joined by Emily, and Adrian is a silent partner who will be in chat tonight. So I will, if he has any questions or comments or anything, I'll try to read them aloud so everyone can follow along. So kind of aggregates have been a theme, I guess, in the book already. So they've been something that's been touched on throughout other chapters, especially when we're talking about entities and value objects, and there were constant references to Chapter 10, and that kind of annoyed me a lot. Just just from the standpoint of, talking about a subject without actually covering it is really obnoxious, I think. So if you kind of read like the very first sentence, he talks about how the idea of aggregates is actually clustering entities and value objects together. So it kind of makes sense that, to me anyway, that they would be grouped together in the book as well. But that's just kind of, I don't know, that's the nature of the book sometimes. I don't know. Adrian says that it kind of annoys him as well. So I think it's been a common theme, and I've probably said that in every single one of these things of all the interdependencies of the chapters is rather difficult to keep up with. So there's that. This particular chapter, I think, was kind of a good dive into the idea of aggregates and just kind of more concrete. I feel like this particular chapter, he did do a very good job of giving us all the examples, like in code and words that made sense that we felt like were missing in the previous chapters. So I guess like right off the bat, when he was talking about, or he gave like the multiple attempts at how Sassivation was going to design their product, and I think was kind of a good dive into the idea of aggregates. And do you all hear the echo too?
Yes.
Like just kind of more. Okay, it sounds like somebody's watching the stream. And are you watching it as well?
I don't think so, but I think it's okay now. I'm not hearing it anymore.
Okay. I think I did this once. I had it like open in a random window somewhere, and it was playing. So then, like 3 minutes after, I just want to make sure it's not me. So okay, cool.
Yeah.
So like I was saying, like I think for me anyway, it was kind of useful to think about the idea of like the rules, and he broke them down very well in the chapter talking about originally having a very large aggregate, or having I think that's what he called it, like a large cluster of objects. So you're talking about a product which has a bunch of backlog items which belong to a particular sprint, and then you've got releases and all this stuff. So he talked about the problem, and the immediate pitfall that's kind of obvious with that is you'll run into memory issues and loading issues, because you're trying to load this product which may have 500 different tasks or backlog items in it. So loading that up in memory is a big problem. So for me, I thought it was extremely useful to look first at what would be a natural breakdown of the aggregate. So you have these 5 concepts that you're trying to represent in your model, and so you've got like a backlog item, and that obviously belongs to a product. So let's just make a product object which is the aggregate, which has a bunch of backlog items, and that kind of makes sense until you start thinking about, well, the model also has to perform, and the model that we're actually implementing, or the thing that we're actually going to build, has to be useful to us in code. So to me, I thought it was extremely useful when he went through that and then said immediately, well, let's look at this from a different way and see if we can break it down into smaller aggregates that are kind of individual but linked and referenced only by ID. So now you've got a product which has a product ID, which I think in his implementation was a separate value object, which was then stored on each of the backlog item in the sprint and the release the released entity or aggregate. They were actually aggregates themselves, but stored there to reference back to the product. So I thought that breakdown of, an initial attempt and then immediately figuring out, hey, that's a really big model, so let's see if we can break it into smaller groups. I think that makes a lot of sense. And looks like we're now joined by Dustin. Dustin, are you there?
Yes. What's going on?
Awesome. We're just getting into aggregates, so.
Sweet.
We're just talking about I was just talking about how, in the book anyway, he went through the original thought of the team, which was to model it all in a huge aggregate, and then broke it down into smaller ones. And I thought that was a really good example of kind of working through a problem to figure out the best model to serve your needs, as opposed to just what makes immediate sense, which to me, the immediate sense would be, let's make a product which has a bunch of backlog items, so we've got this aggregate, and that is it. And then thinking about it further, say, well, I've got to actually consider performance, and I've got to consider how this is used and consider how this actually serves my application. So break it down into smaller aggregates. Do you have thoughts on that?
So one of the things I struggled with, kind of looking to implement or approach problems using aggregates, is that I thought I'm taking something like a CRUD example, so backlog of items or a product with a backlog, and they each have items, and you're thinking about building up your aggregates around these CRUD operations. So I'm thinking, I've got a backlog that is an aggregate that and it's the aggregate root, and I've got these items I'm going to attach. So it's natural that you access, and you can only add those items and access them through that root. But there's that works really well for that example. When I started trying to apply it to things I work on at work regularly, I kind of found myself in this awkward state where I'm missing a concept. I need to keep working it a little bit more than I have. So I think there's definitely some strategy there that I'm not fully picking up on yet. But
so the strategy of when to break things out and when to keep them as a single aggregate, or
yeah, it's just basically approaching the problem and not thinking I got it right the first time. Like I had to break myself of that really quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's kind of natural. Like I think everyone has the inclination to, you're talking about like human nature. I think like just trying to apply. I've seen this kind of before, so I'm going to go ahead and apply my first stab and go for it. I think that's kind of part of the point of all this is to really think, is to think about not only what is technically correct in terms of like if you're forcing I'm thinking in terms of a database, or I'm thinking in terms of a CRUD application, like what is best technically, but then also what is best for how that model actually interacts. Like I think that's kind of where the key is to think, where do I interact with an item? Like do I interact with it through its higher level aggregate, or do I interact with that itself? Like I think that was the theme that the entities chapter, I believe that's where it came in this book, was talking about the idea of how do you determine if something is a value object or an entity, and you have to look at life cycle and how you interact with things, if they change and that sort of thing. So I think from that, taking that and kind of extrapolating it or extracting it to the concept of aggregates, or applying it there, I think it's kind of the same idea of you have to think, how does this cluster of objects work, or how does this cluster of entities, value objects, how do they all work together, and where would I want to actually interact with them? And that kind of helps you decide when to break things into multiples or individuals or whatever.
Right.
But yeah, I don't think that you'll learn it overnight, or I'm not going to learn it overnight. No one can learn it overnight. Like it's just something that takes it's going to take a lot of problem solving and a lot of practice, and every single domain, I would imagine, if you're applying DDD to it, is going to present a new challenge in that regard. So it's kind of, you have to step outside of your own nature of applying what you already know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see. I should really start highlighting things, I think. Except I read it on my Kindle. I was out at the beach last week, so I read on my Kindle, so highlighting it wouldn't have done me a bit of good on this paper book. So I think some of the more interesting parts of this particular chapter was when he talked about the ideas of how you actually implement consistency, or like whether you need to have a particular aggregate be immediately consistent, or if it can eventually be, like, if you can actually queue things up, which I thought was a really good discussion. I personally haven't ever run into the situation where I necessarily had to do that, but I really enjoyed, I think there were like 15 pages or so dedicated to it, which I thought was interesting. Did anyone else get through that particular section?
Yeah. So that's another thing I kind of struggled with approaching this starting out, was knowing how to say, like, is it the aggregate roots or the aggregate's responsibility to be publishing these domain events that other aggregates are interested in listening for, and you achieve eventual consistency that way? Or does an aggregate root or a service that controls that root hold a reference to these other aggregates and drives that longer running process to achieve eventual consistency? So I think there's some play there, but the concept of eventual consistency is fairly interesting, and I think one of the idea that I'm going to save my profile or do some operation, and I'm okay with that not happening right now, that gets published 5 minutes a day a week from now, is something I think a lot of developers that are writing traditional CRUD apps are going to have a hard time kind of getting into the mindset of. But it is interesting.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, because it kind of takes a long time to even get used to any sort of asynchronous processing of anything. So it's very difficult for me anyway to think that way, because I do think linearly. So yeah, I think from my perspective, or from my understanding, I guess, I think it's okay for an entity or an aggregate or an aggregate root or an aggregate or an entity, I guess, to emit the events. I think normally, like, the idea of how you handle consistency. So I think he talked about this he had some examples where you've got an operation that's going to act on two aggregates. And so the idea of, you want to, as a general rule, only act or only modify or interact with a single aggregate in any given command. So I think he talked about that. And so I think that's where the answer would kind of come from, in terms of whether an aggregate should be listening for or dealing with events or applying them, or what have you, or a service. I think that kind of necessitates, to me, that that's done through a service. Like, that's an event can be emitted from an aggregate or an entity, and then acted upon by another service which deals with a completely different aggregate. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And that's, once you kind of wrap your head around that, that's kind of a breakthrough in how you approach implementing those entities as aggregates. Is you only focus around what you're doing inside of that aggregate, and you're publishing events that are important to that aggregate. What happens after that is that's another scoped focus you focus on somewhere else in the system.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is definitely the key. Is you have to stop thinking in terms of how does this whole application work, and think in terms of what does this particular command, what does this particular aggregate care about? And then it just says, hey, this happened. And then whoever wants to care about that can deal with it. Whoever doesn't have to worry about it. So I think that's kind of the key. That's kind of my understanding of it as well. Which I think, so I just actually flipped to this page. And there's a subheading that says ask whose job it is. So I think that's kind of, I don't even know if he was talking about that or talking about the command, the CQS thing at the time, but I think that's kind of the guiding force behind how you decide, or when I would decide, is to ask, which aggregate or which service, or I guess I would ask which aggregate is responsible for this, and then once I determine that would tell me or lead me in the direction of, oh, it should be done through this particular service or what have you. Okay, so another thing that I thought he did a pretty good job of in explaining, or just kind of talking about, was when he's dealing with how you reference models, and like this was, I think, related to the idea of having a product ID that's referenced by a backlog item and what have you, and he was saying that you shouldn't be prevented, I guess, from navigating through an aggregate or through the model just because you're using a reference to identity. So I think that was, early on when I tried to do this, I ran into this problem a lot where I would have these giant aggregates that I had built up, and then I'm like, well, how do I get to the tasks or whatever that are in this particular sprint? So I'm, reaching through 15 layers of an object through a particular method just so I can access that information, and that kind of just screams out as being a huge problem. So I think it was a good discussion for him to include in here about how you can deal with that through application services and that sort of thing. How you can deal with navigating the tree of models just with the idea of reference identity. Okay, so Adrian is asking if I guess this was the previous discussion about whether you use a PubSub pattern or not. And Dustin answered it in chat. I always try. Dustin, I think you missed this part, but I always try to read the chat because people don't always get it. So if you want to answer it, go for it.
Okay.
With your words.
So what I've seen is there. I'll have to go find specific examples, but like Ross Tuck gave this this talk about how you might implement the storage of events, and he wasn't speaking directly to DDD. This is more of a, like, I'm going to raise an event on some object, and it stores a simple array of these typed events. But the idea is that the aggregate itself, that aggregate root, whenever business logic happened that was domain event worthy, you would store something that it's something outside. It's an event you want to let other objects outside of that aggregate's consistency boundary know about. So you raise the event, but it isn't necessarily that aggregate root's job to know how to dispatch that event. That would be the role of one of your application services that might have access to the infrastructure to actually send that event. And it's kind of easy to, like, over-engineer this kind of stuff and put too many layers of indirection between stuff. But that's the idea, is that the aggregate root itself is responsible for keeping track of events that happen while you're doing some transaction on it, and then it's a wrapping service's responsibility to scrape those, send them off to wherever they need to go. But essentially, like, inside of the aggregate, let's say you try to do some operation and gave it invalid arguments, or some business invariant was violated. That's kind of more of a synchronous process inside of that space. So you should never be able to integrate or interact with that aggregate and then it end up in an inconsistent state.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that. And Adrian's point is, it sounds very complicated to implement, and I would say it is, but I mean, it's no more complicated than anything else you do, really. Like the idea here is we're talking about trying to solve complicated business cases with code. So like it is complicated, but it's because it's necessarily complicated to deal with
Yeah.
um, that type of segregation, like that type of boundaries between objects are necessary and sometimes evil. Evil in terms of how difficult they are, like they can be frustrating, but or how difficult it is to wrap your head around it is frustrating. But I think they're necessary in extremely complicated business domains to really think about that as your, I guess, method of operation or whatever.
Yeah.
Let's see if anything else is interesting. I did find it interesting, just like as a side note, that he went back to his advice to think in value objects first, which I think is good advice. Like I remember in the value object chapter, I think someone brought this up, that he said something like, now that you understand what a value object is, you're going to want to make everything a value object, and that's
Mm-hmm.
I think that's okay to think that way first, just because they take a lot of the baggage away. So I did find it interesting that he went back to that advice and kind of reinforced how you would want to kind of approach that in the specific example here.
I kind of like that he had a section on, like a lot of the beginning of the chapter was set up for, here's the rules you operate in, and then there was a whole section dedicated to why you would go against any specific or like specific rules out of that set. And as I was reading through the first time I read this chapter, I was like, okay, what am I going to do when I have someone come to my office that wants this, got some reporting interface, and they want this one-off thing thrown into it that I would have said, like, may have modeled in a different aggregate or something. Now I've got this service layer that's now stringing together aggregates and building a view model or reporting model on top of that. That could get out of hand really quickly.
Yeah.
So I kind of like that he dedicated a section of that chapter to saying, yes, that's a problem, and here's some strategies you can use to kind of approach that. But
yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think that's like kind of one of the cooler or the more interesting parts of the chapter. Especially like when he talked about, or I guess for me it kind of resonated when he was talking about one of the reasons was for performance reasons, and so he kind of touched on this at the beginning when he was talking about the very large aggregate and why you might think about breaking that up into smaller ones. And so I think that is something that that type of thinking took me a long time to really grasp, in terms of, I learned this academic use of DDD, so I've learned all these things, and then I'm going to apply them, and then it's like, well, there are times when you have to sacrifice the academic correctness of your model for performance reasons, or because it's just because of a particular use case, like you were talking about. Like there's some reporting one-off thing that you have to push back on, and so I thought I agree with you. I think that's kind of an interesting or a very useful part of the chapter to kind of read and reread, is just understand that while there are his rules of aggregates, there are also his suspended rules of aggregates, where you have to think about the actual use of the application as opposed to just the academic side.
Yeah.
Which I think he wrapped up towards the end of the chapter, talking about dependency injection. Let me find that. Yeah. Which when I first read the subtitle for it said avoid dependency injection, I was about to flip something, but then I read what he was actually talking about. I said, okay, that makes a lot of sense. He was talking about not injecting repositories into aggregates and
Yeah.
or into services, and I think that's very good advice and something that in my very first application that I ever tried to apply some of this to, I violated that and
Hmm.
very very quickly felt the pain of it. So that's probably the best advice out of the entire chapter to me is just reinforcing this idea that you should really think about the dependencies and think about how you can how you're going to use the different components that you're
Yeah.
learning to build.
It's like when I read through the blue book and then read through this one, tried to implement something, failed miserably, reread parts of the red book again, and you start to look at like why you talk about the practical versus academic, but you start to think about like why some of these rules exist, and if you zoom back up to the beginning of the book, you start talking about bounded contexts and context maps. It's all about isolating yourself or isolating parts of an app away from one another. So when you zoom down to an aggregate, you're talking about now it's really a specialized entity with some objects it owns for its life cycle, but you're isolating it away from other objects in that little module. And
Yeah.
that's, if you recognize that, you can strategically break rules if you need to, but that's the idea, is it's just isolation.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing I really liked about one of the earlier chapters where he was giving the example of, having a luxury that I've never had in my entire career, which is having large enough teams where separate components could be
Yeah.
built out by entirely separate teams and entirely separate practices. So I think early on he kind of hammered home that that is what this helps you do, and so you have to really think when you are implementing something, you have to pretend at least that you don't have the knowledge or the ability to go into another context and you don't understand how it actually works. Like you understand that it's encapsulated in its own context. So you're just interacting with things from the outside, and I think that's kind of the key to me is understanding the separation and then also why that separation exists. And that's one thing that I kind of wish I had the opportunity to do at some point is work on teams that are large enough where the idea of even something as simple as the domain-specific language being different within different contexts, because it is, to me, it's extremely hard for me to think about calling something differently in multiple contexts because it's like I'm the person working on them in all of the contexts. So
Yeah.
it's, to me, a user is always a user. But if I had the luxury of working in something where I wasn't dealing with identity management, I could actually have a moderator. Like I still have these value objects and these roles and stuff that exist, and I still call them by that. But deep down, I know that it's actually a user that came from over here.
Right. Well, I had the problem starting out with all of this thinking, I'm trying to think about different bounded contexts and all this. I'm like, I only have one bounded context. I must be doing it wrong. And that's not true. There are problems where there is no true separation of language between parts of the apps, and those are probably the projects you want to have. But yeah,
Yeah, I think that's my my bounded context is the app, right? That's my context. It all operates here. I'm just kidding. That's not accurate. Um, let's see. Anything else jump out at you as discussion worthy? Anybody? Adrian, I know you have something. I put people on the spot. It's fun. No?
one in one thing that I kind of got out of reading both of these books, these are coming from the perspective of um, a Java application or something like that that has a constant runtime. So he's got a significant portion of this chapter dedicated to memory consumption and things like that, and query performance, and not wanting to have giant aggregates because you don't want to bring that whole thing up and run it.
Yeah.
So when you start considering operating within an environment like PHP, where your memory limits your memory constraints could be even lower, I wonder. I'm hoping that the modeling, the strategy of having aggregates is not a response to being constrained by an infrastructure problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does, and that is kind of, I think, a common theme in this particular book anyway. Has been, how does DDD fit in the Java tool land of Vaughn Vernon? Like how does his team, or how does he deal with certain problems that apply specifically to tools he's using? But I think we do have some parallel, and I think the thing that I would take away from it is less about used aggregates as a response to limitations of specific tooling like ORMs, or issues in how your, or how much memory you have, or whatever. Like I would take less of that and more in terms of when you're thinking about modeling something, there's the, I call it the academically correct, or at least the proper way to model things out, and that's something that you would pick up by reading both of these books, and then kind of just saying, okay, well, that's obviously an entity because it fits this criteria or whatever, and then this is an aggregate because it fits these criteria. But then you have to take that, and after you've figured that type of structure out, then ask yourself, does this apply in where I'm actually implementing this? Because that is something that you do have to deal with. So I guess the TLDR version of that is, it's not necessarily a response, but that is something you have to consider in your model. Like, it's not something you can totally ignore, in my opinion.
Right.
Or maybe I'm wrong, and it's completely a response to just the tooling that was available at the time they were coming up with this stuff. But yeah, to me, it makes a lot of sense to take it from the standpoint of, this is just what has to happen in certain situations. So
yeah, and I think that's what I take away from just aggregates in general. Is it's mostly a strategy to make explicit how you're supposed to use a set of objects.
Yeah, which I think is very powerful, because it's like, if you didn't have an aggregate that was showing you, or providing a boundary that would tell you how you actually interact with things, then that's up to every client or every service to implement that in whatever way it wants to. So you lose all of the power that you gained by modeling something, and like modeling interactions based on what you figured out was how the business views a particular action on data. You lose all of that power, because now you've got to implement it in multiple places, and so it's going to be different. It's going to be named slightly different. It's not going to convey the exact same meaning. So I think it's a necessary tool from that perspective of, you have to orchestrate this. So if you're not orchestrating it in an aggregate, you're orchestrating it in multiple services, most likely.
Right.
I mean, somebody has to do the work eventually, right?
Yeah.
If it's not an aggregate,
Four
it's definitely
layers
gonna
of
be a service.
indirection, and it echoes "Hello World."
Yeah. Well, there is several. There's the enterprise Java version of. It's not Hello World. It's something, FizzBuzz, I think. There's like a. Yeah, that one's pretty awesome. I really like that one. I'm gonna use it as a interview question someday. What's wrong with this? If they don't say it's a terrible idea, then they do not get hired, right? Yeah, I think that's kind of all I took out of the chapter was just the idea of, when you're thinking in terms of how collections work together, like to really understand why you're building the particular collection that you are and how that affects the performance and the outside use case of that particular collection. Like I think that's really all I took out of the chapter, which is kind of sad, but I don't know. That may just be my bias from having done this before. So,
Yeah.
Emily, you seem like you want to say something.
I'm not sure. I know I have questions, but it's not exclusive to the chapter. Still, I didn't read the blue book either, so I'm really jumping into the middle, starting at this chapter.
If you have questions generally about DDD in general, like we discuss
Well,
random things in these as well.
so what I was remembering about aggregating in the little bit that I recognized as an aggregate in Rails was mostly for reporting things where I would collect objects to get report statistics and things. It wasn't a huge operation, but you're kind of boxing yourself off from the things below that aggregated data, right? Or because you're kind of flattening the objects. Is that right?
Flattening how? Like, do you have like a basic example?
No.
Okay.
It's more when I'm reading this, I'm trying to apply it to experiences I've had, and they're not. I still haven't completely gotten my head around how I should be using an aggregate. I may not have been using it correctly before.
Yeah, to me, I mean, just taking a stab, it sounds to me like what you're talking about is was more of a service than it was an aggregate, I think.
Yeah, so it may not have been the right example.
So aggregate's kind of an awkward name for it because typically when I think of an aggregate, the first place my mind goes is a collection of and an aggregate is really more. It doesn't necessarily mean you've got a bunch of person objects or a bunch of backlog items or anything like that. I'm a product and I happen to have a collection of backlog items as well as team members contributing towards the development of that product. It's an object graph starting at one root of related objects.
Okay.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think my original understanding of aggregates was more what a repository is. So it's like
Yeah.
like I always thought of an aggregate root being the way to access all the other, and forgive me for this, but the other database records that were related to it, like the next ones. But what an aggregate really is more of a composition of several components within, like several entities, value objects that make up a particular model, a particular modeled object that you're looking at. So in this example, it's products which have the backlog items, which backlog items are their own thing, which have tasks and estimations. So if you're looking at an aggregate, you're not talking about, if you look at the backlog item aggregate, you're not talking about the collection of backlog items. You're talking about a particular backlog item has these 15 things. So it's the composition of all those properties together that make a new object, essentially. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot more sense. I wasn't really getting that aspect.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Dustin. Like that, like the first time I thought aggregate root, and I thought immediately, this is a bunch of aggregated This is like a collection, essentially.
Yeah.
But totally wrong. as usual. So yeah, there's that.
That's okay. You learn more that way.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have anything else. So if no one else does, we can call this a day, I think. Anybody else?
I'm good.
Nope. All right. Well, thank you all for your participation. I think we'll be back in 2 weeks for the world's shortest chapter in this book. All right. It's literally 10 pages, so that should be a fun one. It's just factories. Actually, how long is repositories?
You should just group the next two.
That's what I was thinking about doing. Yeah, that's like an additional 50 pages. So I may do 11 and 12 next time so we can breeze through those. All right. Like I said, thanks very much for participating. We will see you next time, hopefully.
All right.
Thank you.